Good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming out and to hear me speak. It's been an odd week and an odd trip to Israel, so I'm very grateful for all of you, especially those who have traveled from across the country to come and see me. So for those who aren't familiar with me and my work, I'm first and foremost an ethnographer. I've spent most of my career trying to understand how young people use social media as a part of their everyday life. And I really try to get into the cultural logic. What is it that people do? How do they understand how they engage with social media? And what are the myths that people have about social media? So today, the talk that I've prepared for you is looking at one set of myths and one set of issues, particularly in light of privacy and in light of the ethics issues that come into play. And part of it is that I narrate all of my ways of thinking about social media through the frame of networked publics. And this is the way I like to think of it. For those of you who are sort of more scholarly in mind, this is sort of a fun way of going about rethinking Habermas, rethinking a lot of Warner, different ways of thinking about it. Because I like to think about what constitutes publics in a networked age. And my argument is that the publics that we have today are in many ways networked. And those publics are simultaneously the space that is constructed through the network technologies and the networks of people that come together because of mediated spaces that co-construct the kinds of publics that we see. These publics are actually really powerful because they have a whole set of different kinds of affordances and different kinds of social dynamics that unfold because of them. And that in order to understand a lot of the big shifts, the big ruptures that we're seeing, we need to understand those affordances and some of the social dynamics. So I'm going to give you some overview on this, and then we'll drive it into privacy specifically. So in particular, I like to think about four core affordances that are really shifting as a result of networked publics. The first is persistence. What you say online in a networked environment, in a mediated ecosystem, is very much persistent. It sticks around for a long time. This means that the embarrassing things that you wrote as a teenager on Usenet are still on the internet, which is one of those things that gets me into trouble, and I'm sure you have some embarrassing things out there. Part of it is that this material shifts through your life and you can actually read it. The second key affordance that's critical to understand in networked publics is replicability. Right? This is the very essence of how information is spread online. You can replicate things from one place to another, copy and paste. Right? But what's important about replicability is that you don't know the difference between the duplicate and the original. And this creates some interesting confusions, right? Because you're not sure if something has been taken and moved, where it was really originated. Was that the original statement? Were things modified? Getting into that is actually very difficult in a mediated environment. Third key affordance has to do with searchability. My mother would have loved the ability to stand in a room and scream "find" and figure out where I was when I was with my friends. She couldn't, for which I am deeply, deeply grateful. But today's young people are extremely searchable. And they're not just searchable by anybody. They're searchable by people who hold power over them. People like teachers, law enforcement, college admissions officers, all of these actors who are actively seeking them out. Right? And that searchability is a really challenging dynamic because when you start to add it up with the replicability and with the persistence, we start to see these interesting dynamics. And the fourth key affordance, which sort of magnifies all of this, has to do with scale. Right? What happens in a mediated environment becomes scaled at unprecedented levels. Now, this doesn't mean that all things are visible to all people across all space and all time. And this is part of what makes it really confusing. Because you put something up there thinking that it will be read by millions of people, and 6 people show up, right? And that's a really common dynamic online, which is that your tweet's not actually read by everybody, right? But at the same time, the things that you put up online that you really hoped would never be read by anybody, inevitably the things that were really embarrassing, those, of course, are what get read by millions, right? And this is what complicates the scaling dynamic. What scales isn't necessarily what you want to scale, and it becomes a really confusing set of things to deal with. Now, if you think about those affordances, those four, as they sort of interact with each other, none of them are particularly unique to the internet. We've seen them in other existing media, but they come together in everyday life in a really powerful way. And what they mean is that young people and anybody engaging with social media has to deal with a set of shifting dynamics that are really confusing if you think about them outside of their professional context. Let me give you 3 examples. The first is the idea of invisible audiences, right? I can stand up here in front of you and give a lecture. And I have a sense that you've come to listen to me. Hopefully you understand English. Hopefully I'm making sense at some level. I watch and I try to see whether you're nodding, whether you're following along, to try to judge you as an audience. Meanwhile, there's a big red blinking dot back there that signals that there's a camera recording me. I have no idea who's at the other end of that camera. Are they watching this in 2012, or are they watching it in 2020, where Facebook no longer makes sense? Right? Do they have any understanding of the context in which I'm speaking, the time, the space, the culture? Not necessarily. How do you navigate these very unknown, invisible audiences? And what we, of course, see is people imagine their audiences, and they go through a whole process trying to deal with it. The second key dynamic that plays out in network publics that shapes a lot of this has to do with the collapsing of contexts. Right? Once again, we're in a lecture hall. In theory, any one of you could start standing on your chair and dancing and singing and doing whatever you wanted, right? There's nothing stopping you except a whole set of social norms that say this is not appropriate, right? And part of it is that we understand what this context is. But meanwhile, when we go online, we're dealing with contexts that are often colliding. We have a lecture context sitting along with our context of talking to our friends about the latest TV show, sitting alongside of all of these other sort of social dynamics with our kids. It's very confusing to make sense of it. Now again, none of these are particularly new. Collapsed context, we deal with it over and over again. Of course, interestingly, if you look at major social situations in which contexts collapse, we usually tend to add alcohol to them as a way of solving the problem of confusion, right? Not necessarily always the best solution, but it's one of the ones that we commonly use for context collapse. But part of it is that confuses all of these environments. Now the third, of course, is the blurring of what we normally think of as public and private, right? Our spaces that we've defined to be public, our spaces that we've defined to be private. More often than not, adults tend to see the home as a private space, even when their children tend to disturb any notion of privacy they've ever had, right? They don't see it as a public space. Meanwhile, young people often think that home is much more public because they have no control over what's going on. So you have these interesting questions of that. Now add the internet, right? Is hanging out on Facebook at home public, private? How do you understand what that space is? We see a constant blurring. So this sort of drives me into this question around how do we understand privacy in network publics? And I'll begin with a quote that sort of sparked a lot of my interest in this. And it's a quote from a young woman named Bly, who was actually talking on a radio show in the United States where she was talking about the desire she had to have privacy online. And she was really frustrated because her mother has a tendency to always look at her content. And as she complains, my mom uses the excuse about the internet being public when she defends herself at looking at what she's posted online. And Bly responds, it's not like I do anything to be ashamed of, but a girl needs her privacy. Right? And her mother and her go back and forth in this radio show, totally disagreeing about what constitutes privacy in a networked age. Her mother basically arguing that if she can see it, why shouldn't she look? If somebody else can see it, why shouldn't she be allowed to? Right? Which is one of the things that we see as an ongoing tension of how privacy is constructed. So I wanted to sort of dive into looking at how did young people understand privacy? What did they think was going on when they were engaging in social media? And one of the biggest things I started to realize is that we had this set of myths that people had about how young people, they don't care about privacy. And people use Bly as an example. See, they don't care about privacy, but Bly's saying she does. What's really at play is that there's a radical shift going on in what are the defaults. So we see young people sharing at unprecedented levels, right? You can get access to more content about young people today than ever before. But that doesn't necessarily mean that young people have given up on privacy. So what's really changing? Now, if we have an interaction, right? Gustavo and I are talking out in the hallway. Well, our conversation is by default private. Not because we've agreed to make it private, but because Gustavo's probably not going to bother taking the time or effort to share what I told him. Right? I might tell him about, my stay in Ra'anana, what's going on. He might tell somebody else I'm staying in Ra'anana, but the details of our conversation stay private because he doesn't make the effort to make it public. Right? And that's how most of our interactions happen on a daily basis. We think that we are speaking in a private context because there's no reason to have them shared. Online, things get inverted. They get inverted because conversations are much easier to be made public than ever before, and the defaults in many ways become public by default, private through effort. Right? And so what we see is that young people are sharing massive amounts of data online because they're not bothering to privatize it. Meanwhile, when we think about our face-to-face encounters, we think about what we have to publicize. And it's that weird inversion that we get the breakfast problem. Right? And the breakfast problem is basically that if I told Gustavo what I had for breakfast, he's not going to bother publicizing that. That's really lame. Meanwhile, online, we will often share our breakfast just as a way of sort of doing a wake-up call. Hey, I'm up. Here's what I had for breakfast. I'm hanging out, right? And it's not because, the information about breakfast is particularly private either to Gustavo or onto Facebook. It's because the contexts are really different, right? Gustavo doesn't bother publicizing it. I don't bother privatizing it. And that's a lot of why we see the slippage of a ton of media. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that young people aren't privatizing certain things. And what we see is that they're very acutely aware of things that they don't want to spread, rather than things that they do want to spread. So they often put things up and they're like, doesn't matter, but think through what they're concerned about. Now, of course, there are always people that they don't want to be present. And this is one of the odd and awkward tensions, because you see this moment where young people are putting material up there and they're like, you don't belong there. Bly thinks her mom doesn't belong there. This is Chantal talking about her frustration at her teachers, right? Don't they understand they're not belonging there, they're not wanted there? And this is where we start to see this frustration, because it's very hard to maintain boundaries. Boundaries become really difficult in a mediated environment where, again, things are persistent, things are searchable, they're easily spreadable. So I started to realize that we often talk in technology worlds about privacy as the ability to control the flow of information. Right? This is very much legal discourse and very much computer science discourse. Right? If we can just give people the tools to control the flow of information, all of our privacy woes will be solved. And I think that this is really naive, and for a variety of different reasons. But the one I want to drill into is that I think that it misses what's actually necessary to control the flow of information. And in particular, there are sort of three things that are absolutely essential if we want to think about the control of flow of information. First, you need to have a sense of agency. You need to have power. You need to be able to assert control over a situation. If your mother is lurking over your shoulder, there's no way you get to achieve privacy online, no matter what you do, no matter what the Facebook settings do, right? So the ability to have agency is a really tricky one because we often assume it when we think about giving people, allowing them to think of control of information as the way to get privacy. The second key thing that is required to get to that control of the flow of information is the ability to have the skills to actually move information, to control information. The skills to deal with privacy settings, which people are notoriously bad at, especially on Facebook, right? It's really hard to actually have those skills when you're not sure what the environment is like. And the third is the social wherewithal to understand the dynamics well enough to figure out how to flow that information. Now, this is, of course, something that we learn over time, right? You learn who can gossip really well. And you know that if you just tell them, don't tell anybody, I told you this, that you know it'll flow really fast, right? That's an ability to understand the social situation and flow things. Of course, it's a process that we learn over time. And what we see is that a lot of young people are in the process of learning it. So they're often missing these different elements, and often because it's undermined from them. So then we start to see, how do they actually try to achieve privacy? And I want to give you some examples of some young people who have done some fun things to try to achieve privacy. And I'm going to begin with Hunter. Hunter really wants to assert the social norms. He wants people to understand the boundaries because they should just know. They should know what the boundaries are because it's obvious. And what he's talking about in this example is, or I guess I should give a context on Hunter. Hunter is a 14-year-old black man living in Washington, D.C. He is an American citizen, but his parents and his sister are undocumented, living in the States. He describes his sister as being very ghetto and often derides her interests and tastes. He's very frustrated because he's really passionate about school and really geeky things, and nobody from his family understands. His family is much more sort of typical inner city culture and inner city dynamics. And so he's talking about how on Facebook all of these things collide simultaneously, and it's often really frustrating to him. And he says, when I'm talking to my friends on Facebook or I put up a status, something I hate is when people who I'm not addressing in the statuses comment on them. In my old school, people used to call me nerdy and say that I was the least black person that they've ever met. And some people would say that on Facebook, and I say, should I take offense to the fact that somebody put the ringtone white and nerdy is for me? And it was a joke. And then out of nowhere comes my sister saying, oh, baby bro. And I'm like, no, don't say that. Right? And he's constantly struggling with this. His sister jumping in and making these comments and him getting really, really frustrated. And so the thing is that he quickly learns that asserting the social norms is really hard. Now, of course, I say, how are people supposed to know this? Right? And he responds by saying, well, I guess that's the point. It's hard, but it's a certain way you talk. I will talk to my sister in a different way than I talk to my friends. Right? And he expects his sister to understand this. But what we see over and over again is that these attempts to assert social norms never work when power is at play. They never work when people have to deal with people who want to assert power over them. And there is nothing like a big sister to want to assert power. Right? So you have this interesting tension where he's really frustrated because he's trying to divide his worlds. He wants people to understand, and they're constantly colliding. And they're doing it in ways that are really embarrassing to him. So what does he do? He actually turns to very technical means as a way of achieving privacy. So his first attempt to do it has to do with his passion for video games. What's really funny about Hunter is that he's really passionate about a set of games that he calls old school, and that they were really cool back in the day, which I was very disturbed to find out consists of Legends of Zelda and Pokemon, which basically made me feel very, very old, right? But these old school video games were really cool amongst his geeky friends, but they were not cool amongst his family. His family was much more interested in shooter games, particularly his cousins. If he would talk about shooter games on Facebook, his friends from school would ignore it. But if he would talk about Legends of Zelda, his cousins would jump in and basically make fun of him. Right? They would make fun of him, they would tease all of his friends, and they'd shoot them down about what they were saying. So what he started to do was setting up filters just to create a space where he could talk about Legends of Zelda without actually having to deal with the collision of contexts. It wasn't that he was embarrassed by his passion for Legends of Zelda. It was that he was really frustrated that his cousins didn't know how to actually understand the boundaries. Right? It's a way of using the very technical systems in many ways in the way that Facebook designed them. Now, of course, this is the sort of classic what you should use the filters for. But there are other ways of actually doing radical things with the technology. And I'm going to give you two examples that are by no means typical, but they show things at the extreme ends to start to see how young people get innovative in an attempt to achieve privacy. The first of them comes from a case study with a young woman named Shamika. The thing about Shamika is that she's in a school where she finds that everybody likes to cause drama. Causing drama basically means taking anything you can to embarrass somebody and get fights brewing just for fun. And what she found is that the most popular way of achieving drama in her school was that people would take content from way back in Facebook, i.e. 2 months ago, which is way back, and they would bring it to the present. And they would bring that, conversation that was happening about a boy suddenly into the present, and it would be a massive blow up, right? And she was like, this is ridiculous. She doesn't want all of this stuff from the past, again, 2 months, to suddenly become present. So she decides that she will engage in something that she talks about as whitewalling. What this means is that every day, Shamika logs into Facebook, she reads the comments that people left on her page, and then she deletes them. She leaves comments on other people's pictures, and then the next day when she's on Facebook, she goes around to where she had left comments, and she deletes them. And she basically goes through a process to make things as ephemeral as possible, to resist the very essence of that persistence, right? To resist the idea that this content would be available, forever. Now, she points out rightfully that anybody could save this, right? People actually have this content. It was often notified on somebody's pages. But she points out that anybody who bothers to bring that back from the past because it was saved somewhere is really creepy and weird. Right? So the thing is that it changes it from being a technical issue to an issue of social norms. And that change is enough to be a buffer against this. It's not that she's embarrassed by the comments, but she doesn't want them brought back to the present every single time. Now, a more radical and extreme version of it comes from Michaela. Michaela is also a young woman living in DC, and she's under state care. Basically, she's in foster care. She moves from family to family in group homes, the result of which is that the state is always paying attention to her, often in an attempt to give her a housing situation. But I won't go into a rant about American social services. But you can imagine that this is not always works out the way it seems. Michaela is very frustrated because all of these adults, whenever she's going through a transition, these adults go and they track all of her conversations online, and they use that to warn the new custodians, and they use that and they share this in really problematic ways. And she's really frustrated that adults are always in her business, right? So she started realizing something. One day she went and she tried to delete her Facebook account. Now, if any of you have actually decided to delete your Facebook account, it's a really fun process, right? Because it goes through this whole guilt structure, right? American guilt at its best. You don't really want to delete your Facebook account, do you? These people will miss you, sad faces from your friends. You don't have to delete your account. You can just deactivate it, and then you can come back anytime. It'll all be there for you, no worries. So she did. She deactivated her account. And the next day, she logged in and she reactivated it. And when she was done using it at the end of the day, she deactivated it again. And she did it the next day, and the next day, and the next day. And what she did was that she turned Facebook into a real-time activity. The only way that you could send messages to her, the only way that you could leave comments for her, the only ways that you could search for her were if you were logged in at the same time as she was. And I said, well, how do you actually protect this from adults? I mean, adults might be logged in at the same time as you do. And she says, oh, no, they only log in while at work. So if I log in after 6, I'm totally fine. I just never log in during the day. Right? It's a way of attempting to actually deal with, again, the affordances that are a part of this. An attempt to gain control over the searchability, to turn Facebook into something that allows it to be real time. It's, again, a way of creating boundaries. Now, these, of course, are two really esoteric approaches to it. Innovative, fabulous, but not necessarily mainstream. The most mainstream is something that I've watched over the last decade ramp up in commonality. And this has to do with a way of achieving privacy by basically encoding information. Right? I'm going to tell you about Carmen. Carmen is a young woman living in Boston, and her mother is of Argentinian descent. Doesn't necessarily recognize American culture, let alone European culture, which is really critical for this example. And she's, always wanting to talk to her friends, and she likes to share her feelings and her emotions. Her favorite way of doing this is, of course, to put song lyrics, because if you're a teenager, song lyrics are definitely the best way to express any emotion. Some of you might remember this from back in the day. Now, the challenge with her mom is that her mom is, always engaging with her on Facebook. She loves that her mom is on Facebook. She thinks that her mom's great on Facebook. She talks to all of her extended family on Facebook. This is awesome. But her mom is also really frustrating because her mom tends to comment on everything. And as Carmen points out, when her mom comments on anything, she's like, don't do that. And I ask her why, why don't you delete it? And she's like, I don't want my mom to feel bad. And I said, well, why don't you want her commenting? And she said, well, it scares everyone away. Everyone kind of disappears after the mom post. Right? So she's sort of like, okay, how do you make certain that mom doesn't necessarily comment on things? Well, one day, Carmen was having a really crappy day. She and her boyfriend had just broken up, and she really wanted to tell all of her friends that she was feeling really crappy because she really wanted the social support. She wanted to actually get the love. She knew if she put something on Facebook that she was having a down day, that people would contact her, and she really wanted that. She also knew that if she posted song lyrics from My Chemical Romance, which of course was the popular thing at the time, that her mom would totally overreact, think she was suicidal, and panic. Right? And this happened on a regular basis, so she was really concerned about it. But she and her friends had recently had a sleepover, and they had all watched a movie together. So she decided to put up song lyrics from that movie, knowing that her friends would recognize it and her mother wouldn't. She put up song lyrics from the song Always Look on the Bright Side of Life. For those who don't know the geeky reference, it is a song sung in the life of Brian when the key character is being crucified. It is not a happy song, but the song lyrics look really, really happy. So she decides that she posts this. Her mom immediately comments, "It looks like you're having a great day." Her friends immediately text her. right? As a way in which she was able to hide her feelings in plain sight, make it totally available to her mother, but content-wise, but not necessarily make the meaning available. You know, the way that I like to think about this is as a form of social steganography. Right? For those who understand the crypto term, it's basically an old tactic of hiding in plain sight. It goes back to some really sordid histories, my favorite of which involved Greek slaves being tattooed on their heads with messages, letting their hair grow in, and then sending them off, because you had to actually know to look under their hair. The idea was that you had to know where to look, right? Steganography is about realizing that that content is available, but you don't necessarily know where to find it. And what I've started to realize is that over the last decade, as parents have gotten involved in social media, what young people are doing is doing everything possible to hide in plain sight. They don't achieve privacy by controlling the flow of information or trying to restrict the content. Instead, they try to achieve privacy by restricting access to meaning. And this is an extraordinarily powerful way to circumvent all of the other things that are going on there. Now, that said, when they're trying to restrict access to meaning, sometimes they like to perform that that's exactly what they're doing. Make it really obvious to people that they don't know what's going on, right? This is the classic in-joke. And I was sitting in North Carolina with a young woman, and we were going through Facebook. And I saw these two statuses on her feed. And one said, you know, I'm sick and tired of all of this. And it was liked by 32 people. And a little while later, I saw, she's such a bitch. And it was liked to 50 people. And I was like, what's going on there? And sure enough, Serena was able to give me this long rundown. Needless to say, it involved a boy, there was drama, there was all sorts of things that had played out, and they were basically talking about it. Her entire peer group was talking about what was going on using pronouns, right? References like she, references like this and it, never explicitly talking about what they were talking about, but they all knew exactly what was going on. And people were taking sides by liking. Right? Needless to say, that in this school, the teachers had a lot of purview into Facebook, completely oblivious to what was happening. Right? We see this moment because even when teachers saw this, and teachers did recognize the second one, they can't step in and be like, who's a bitch? Right? Because that's not going to really fly. Right? So nobody's going to respond. It's like, oh, I don't know what they're talking about. Right? Which is the classic response. So here we have this sort of dynamic of, again, hiding in plain sight, but in this way, making it really clear that that's hiding. Right? And this is an interesting tension that we see as sort of the core way in which I've watched young people attempt to achieve privacy through a lot of what they've done online. They do encoding. Okay, I want to jump this in and give you another sort of way of thinking about it through the lens of visibility. All of this is happening in public. We're seeing all of this material going on. Things are more visible today than they ever were before in history. But how do we understand that which is visible? How do we actually make sense of it? Right? The meaning is often encoded. It's very confusing what's going on. Well, what I've started to realize is that visibility is the thing that's radically shifting a whole variety of practices online. We think we understand what's going on because we are reading the content, but we are not necessarily reading the context or making meaning out of it. This becomes most salient in a lot of my research in the areas of bullying. So I'm going to give you American data. I don't know Israeli data, so forgive me on this. But in the United States, we have not seen a rise of bullying as a result of the internet. By and large, bullying has stayed relatively the same. And if you define bullying in the Olvea sense, which means psychological, physical, or social aggression repeated over time by people of differential physical or social power, we see that kids continue to report that it happens more frequently at school and with greater emotional duress than anything that happens online. But yet, at the same time, we've got a massive panic about cyberbullying. What's going on? What we found is that, of course, the bullying that happens online is far more visible to adults than any of the bullying that happens at school. The bullying at school is much more emotionally costly to young people, but parents don't see it. So if your kid comes home with a black eye, or your kid comes home feeling grouchy, you might know what's going on. But you don't necessarily know all the details. When you see things on Facebook, you think you understand what's going on. And that's when we started to see the twist of it. Young people also report that their parents tend to take things that they see online and expand on what it might mean, even when it has nothing to do with bullying. So they interpret a prank as a bullying situation. They interpret something that is just, a joke between friends as a bullying. And you start to see this challenge around the spectrum. This is one of the ways in which visibility plays out. Now, of course, there's a flip side to this. And I'm going to tell you a story that's pretty heartbreaking. This is the story of a young woman in Colorado who basically she and a friend of hers went and killed her mother. And what's really heartbreaking about this story is that, of course, the media, this was at the height of MySpace, the media publicized it as girl with MySpace kills mother, which is always really helpful. So I actually went and looked at this young woman's MySpace. For over a year and a half on MySpace, this young woman had documented the abuse that she faced at home. Her mother's alcoholism, her mother's rages, her attempts to run away, her feeling bad and coming back, her attempts to get help, nobody listening and her coming back, on these dynamics. And what you see is that this year and a half of documentation that is highly visible, and yet nobody is paying attention. Right? And that's this flip side, is just because these things are out there doesn't mean people are paying attention. Now, of course, as the story unfolded, I started talking to a lot of this young woman's friends. They had all reported it to the school. They had seen this and they were really worried about her. But when they reported it to the school had filtered or blocked MySpace. So they said, sorry, we can't look, which was really great. Interestingly enough, this young woman had come to school on a regular basis with black and blue marks. So the school had actually reported it to social services. But by the time social services would investigate, the girl had no marks on her body, the result of which is they said there was no documentation to prove that she was actually being abused. So that all of the places where she could get help were missing the fact that this content was wholly visible, but no one was paying attention. So we have this flip side of things where people pay attention to some things they see, but not others. This is where, I'm working on this pretty intense project right now on human trafficking, and particularly the commercial sexual exploitation of children, or CSEC. And one of the things that's really frustrating about CSEC is that we have this awkward moment where for the first time we're able to see records of young people being sold through a lot of media. It's not records of everybody being sold, it's records of some. What happens is that we start to see a political discourse into this. And in the United States, we've seen this attempt by US government officials to block all of the sites where this stuff starts to appear. The argument is, if we just make it be invisible, it will go away. Guess what? That's not how these things work. So we also have this awkward question of ethics. When should we leverage something that is visible? When should we actually do something about it? Now, of course, doing something about it isn't always easy. For those of you who have looked into eating disorders, one of the things you might know is that there's a history of something called pro-Ana. Pro-Ana is pro-anorexia. It's a whole online community that have emerged since the 1990s of people with anorexia talking about anorexia. But what's interesting is that that material got censored back in the day, back in the 90s, and people tried to block that material, again, hoping, like with trafficking, that it would go away if they just stopped it. What emerged was something called pro-Ana. The result of which is that people would write long essays to their dear friend Anna about how they had had a good day. It was a way of signaling to the public that they had spent the day not eating, right? And we started to see, again, this back to the encoding issue. We see the encoding, unlike the examples that I gave you, which are very much about youth culture staying safe, this is about youth culture actually being at risk and further going into darker spaces in an attempt to encode. Now, all of this butts up against an ethos of the technology industry, an ethos of radical transparency. We believe in the technology sector there's a rhetoric that if people just were more visible, if they were just transparent about everything that they did, we'd eradicate all forms of inequality. This rhetoric drives me absolutely crazy. It is highly propagated, in particular by Facebook, who believes that if you just out people, that we will solve all of the problems. The classic example here is that if gay people were just more openly gay, that we wouldn't have a problem with gay people, right? Unfortunately, that's not how the history of this has worked, right? And so there's been these interesting processes, again, of what's the ethic? Who gets to make people visible? Who actually gets to leverage the visibility? Who gets to leverage the meaning and interpretation? Now, one of the reasons that I bring up an LGBT issue is that there's an amazing history of this within the queer community. I'm going to give you an example that totally complicates all of our understandings of outing. Outing, of course, is the notion of if you out somebody who is a public figure, that it will actually do good by society because we can start to see that there are more queer folks in society. Well, in 1975, in San Francisco, there was a man by the name of Oliver Sipple. Oliver Sipple was a gay man living in the Castro in San Francisco. He was a former Marine from the U.S. in the U.S. military, and he was not out to his family. He was not out to most of his friends outside of his Castro circle. Well, what happened is that the sitting president, U.S. President Ford, went to San Francisco to speak. When Ford was there, another woman jumped and tried to assassinate President Ford. She attempted to shoot him. Sipple, watching what was unfolding, managed to grab the woman, push her aside. The shot went wild. Nobody was hurt. Nobody was killed. Sipple was immediately leveraged up as an American hero who saved the president, right? And the White House wanted to bestow honors on him. Newspapers wanted to cover stories about him. He was a big deal. And when the San Francisco Chronicle, which is sort of the core newspaper of that region, interviewed him, he knew the reporter and he knew the community. He said, do me a favor, let's not talk about my sexuality, right? And they agreed. But a few days later, a man by the name of Harvey Milk, who is a very famous queer activist living in California, decided that this was unacceptable, that the public needed to have a gay hero, and that Sipple fit the bill perfectly. He went on to national TV, and he totally outed Sipple. The results were devastating for Sipple. Sipple was totally distanced from the White House. The White House didn't want to talk to him. His family completely rejected him. He started gaining massive amounts of weight. He started drinking profusely. He died at the age of 47. And if you see the records of it, he regretted his acts of heroism. It was one of the things that he most deeply regretted in his life. And this raises a really important ethical question. What are the costs to individuals for things that are sort of seen as being for higher moral values? And this is a challenge that we constantly come up against whenever we think about the process of making things more visible than they once were. So let's bring this back to a Facebook example. At the end of 2008, Facebook decided that it would change its privacy settings. And part of its changing of its privacy settings was to make all of the defaults very public, very visible. Now, unless you were really technologically savvy, you didn't necessarily know what those shifts were about or how they played out. The result of which is that a lot of people's content was made more visible than anybody realized. The case that I was particularly concerned about was a case from the United Arab Emirates. A young woman on Facebook who had been talking to various boys, which was of course completely unacceptable in the Emirates. When her content was made visible, her father killed her. Unfortunately, it's not the only case that we started seeing of people whose material has accidentally leaked on Facebook. And here's where we get this interesting challenge, because a lot of the ethos in communities is like, well, if you don't want to be public, don't be on Facebook. But of course, as we know, participation on Facebook is really critical to being a part of a social community. Another case, a young woman that I actually interviewed in this process, ran into major issues because she was under state protection from her father. But when Facebook made things more visible, she didn't know it. And unfortunately, her father found her, even though she was living thousands of miles away. So again, what are these individual costs? What are these moral and ethical costs to the process of making things visible? Now, through these technologies, we can see into the lives of many people. It creates these opportunities to do good, right? Can we intervene when we see somebody who's really struggling? When should we do an intervention? What happens when we overreact to the things that we think we see and we think we understand? What happens and who's held responsible when things are made more visible? Who has the right to make things more visible? Technology companies, people, researchers, right? It becomes a huge ethical issue for all of us as we think about the visibility. So let's think then about, as we go forward into the future, who's actually doing the interpretation? And how do we start to make sense and make meaning out of all of these things that we see? And I'd like to sort of put in the back of your mind that this is of particularly interest to the whole ethos of big data. Now, I understand that this is a highly contested term, and I actually think that it's appropriate because of its high political value. And what I think is important to realize is that big data is not about data being big. It's a cultural, technological, and scholarly phenomenon, right? And it's a thing that we're all talking around rather than talking about. But it's a phenomenon that actually has a lot of traction within the public conversation. Because it's the idea that, if we just have more data, we can make meaning out of all of the problems on the internet, right? And we can understand all of society really easily if we just had more data. And there are some people making amazing strides at doing really important meaning making, using a lot of the machine learning tactics that are embedded within big data, but it doesn't necessarily mean that just because we have data that we can make sense of it. So I love to use Jeff Bowker. This quote is just too priceless to not use. He argues that raw data is both an oxymoron and a bad idea. To the contrary, data should be cooked with care. And I think it's a really valuable mantra for thinking about how we understand all of this material that we're coming into, especially as researchers. Right? Many of you are from the sort of more sociological disciplines, where we understand that it's not just the process of data collection and precise data collection, but the process of interpretation that is extremely important. But this is going to be a way of thinking that we need to actually have a public conversation about. Because more and more we see people scraping data thinking that they can make meaning out of things without realizing that this is not what's going on. Making meaning is not an automatic process. When the meaning making is often really confused, when you see things that you don't understand. And this is particularly true when you start to think about cross-cultural issues. Right? It's easy for you to make sense or make meaning out of the things that are familiar to you. But more often than not, with a lot of this social media, we're dealing with massive cultural collisions, massive differences in interpretation, massive differences in what is put up and what is normative. Now, some of this is not always about big data. This is all about the sort of cultural dynamics of all forms of data. And I'll give you a funny example, which was one of my more embarrassing panels ever. I was on a panel during the height of MySpace again, and it was with a bunch of brands. And there was a representative from Coca-Cola who was really proud about how frequently Coca-Cola was getting friends. It had millions of friends, and how Coca-Cola was becoming a topic by all of these young people. They had all this data. They showed all this data. Look at how important Coke was. Unfortunately, that wasn't the Coke that the young people were referring to. And that was a really awkward conversation to explain to a bunch of representatives from Coca-Cola, right? This, of course, is, an entertaining version of encoding, but part of what makes it important is that when we're pulling a lot of this data and we don't understand why it's produced, we often interpret it in all the wrong ways. Now, this is, of course, where humans are making the interpretations. But one of the other challenges that we have is that more and more we're seeing algorithmic interpretations. Of course, personalization is one of the issues there. Sometimes these interpretations are really funny, right? I apparently am a truck driver, right? Google is absolutely convinced of it. It sends me all sorts of advertisements about why I should buy different cabbies. And the reason why is, as an ethnographer, I spend a lot of time in a lot of motels around the US trying to get Wi-Fi from any truck stop I can possibly do. I look like a trucker. It entertains me and it's really funny. But sometimes that personalization and those algorithms actually have cultural implications. And this is an example from a colleague of mine, Mike Onaney. He was going and he was downloading an app on Android, and the app was for Grindr. I don't know if you're familiar with Grindr, but Grindr is an app for gay men to find people within the community. But what is really interesting to Mike is that when he downloaded Grindr, he was fascinated by the recommendations that he received about what application he should download next. In particular, he was encouraged to download a site for sex offender searches. Right? Now, part of the politics in the United States about queer issues is that many from the religious communities believe that all gay men are sex offenders. Right? So here's this interesting moment where the connection is being made, and no one's quite sure why. And now Mike decided to put this up really publicly, and he did it through a series of questions. He said that, in theory, people could be downloading both of these applications. It's possible, not sure why, but maybe. Another possibility is that they use terminology that is similar. Another possibility is that they're part of some association by someone within the company because they were categorizing things as adult, right? It's not entirely clear where this comes from. So he asked this as a series of questions, hoping that would provoke an answer. Of course, the answer from Google was simply to remove its very existence, right? And to remove that connection. But one of the things that we see is that, other people who can't put articles into the Atlantic suddenly see these correlations that are put out there without necessarily realizing why. So how do we think about these connections and who becomes responsible for making connections with cost? Now, sometimes, and this is where we get into amazing debates in the US about privacy, these connections get to be a little too eerie. And I don't know how many of you followed the Target story, but the Target story in the US caused all sorts of kerfuffles. The basic way that the Target story worked is that Target had been doing very classic, since the 1970s, targeted marketing, trying to understand who out there might want certain products. The most valuable customer for all of Target is somebody who is pregnant, a woman who is pregnant. The reason why is because a woman who is pregnant will make decisions and they will shift what stores they shop in. During that period before birth, they will actually shift their stores and they will stick with them for the next 10 years. So the goal is to try to identify somebody while they're pregnant. Now, this is often done by registrations of when people are married. The assumption is there's only a certain number of years on average, depending on your class, in which you are likely to be pregnant. And again, you make these guesses. That's the old school way. Well, what Target realized is that they had massive amounts of data about purchasing patterns, and then when they could see somebody actually being pregnant, that they could predict somebody was pregnant. So they would start to send them advertisements, in their homes, being like, hey, thinking about having a child, trying to not put it, we know you're pregnant because that's creepy, but, hinting at it. Well, the father of a 16-year-old saw that these were sent to his daughter, and he called up Target, furious. What do you think my daughter is? She is not a slut. How dare you send her such materials? Blah, 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 blah. Target then went and, of course, investigated this and, weren't sure what was going on, but it called it escalated, called the father back and apologized and said, I'm really, really sorry. The father's response was, well, there are things happening in my house that I didn't know about. This turned into a New York Times story, which sort of made a lot of traction within the United States. But it's one of these interesting challenges because just because we can algorithmically determine certain things doesn't mean that actually providing that back is going to go over well. And what are the boundaries about what we can do and what's acceptable? The ethical questions we need to consider, of course, are, who's interpreting the data, for what purposes, and what are the restrictions there? Now, I want to conclude with some of the sort of comments on where some of this control is coming into play. I've given you some different ideas of privacy, both at a social level and, of course, at a data level. But part of what's important to realize is that there's a lot of moving pieces right now. There's some interesting things happening in Israel regarding privacy regulation. We're, of course, seeing a whole set of different issues in Brussels, in Canada, in the United States, and in Australia. I think the thing to keep in mind is that no matter what, the next 18 to 24 months are going to be a lot of even more intense conversations about privacy. And we're going to hear about it from the frame of legal regulation, even when the law is not the best actor to intervene in this area. Because part of it is that people are really confused about what's going on. People don't understand what's happening with their data. They don't understand how they're trying to get control over things. Things are slipping in ways that don't make sense. People are flipping out. And some of their flipping out is totally because of their experiences and their understandings. So for example, you may have seen that a couple months ago, Facebook ran into a big problem because they put all this material back from the timeline from like 2004, 2005, 2006. And people flipped out saying this was private material. Facebook, of course, went back and found actually it was not restricted material. It's just that people's audience in 2004, 2005, 2006 was very different. So people's mental models of it were that it was private. This is one of the ways in which data is slipping, but there's a lot of different issues around data that's going to result in a lot of panics and legal regulations. Now, I think it's important to realize that there are many different ways to regulate a social system. And this is Larry Lessig's sort of classic red dot. And what Lessig has argued over the years, and in particular in his book Code, which is a beautiful book, is that there are 4 things that regulate any particular social system: the market, the law, social norms, and technology or architecture. Right? And when these 4 are aligned, magical things happen. And he gives great cases about how changes were made because these things were aligned. But what we're finding is in the areas of privacy, we're not seeing alignment. We're seeing total disconnect. What technology makes possible is different than what the market is really incentivized to. The laws are not necessarily technologically savvy, and people are trying to project onto the social norms rather than realizing that the social norms themselves can serve as a regulatory function. But I think this is valuable as a sort of way of thinking about it because I'm not convinced that the legal approach is the best way. I think part of it is to figure out how we leverage social norms as a regulatory force that actually challenges these other forces, because we do actually need shifts to really happen. Now, part of why I get frustrated by some of the legal discourses is because law is structured, of course, to focus on the individual. And it really likes to focus on informed consent. But informed consent, of course, assumes that, again, people have agency, the ability to actually consent to things, and that they actually understand the social systems well enough to be informed. Right? And this goes back to the very essence of how we understand privacy. If privacy is just about controlling the information, and you assume agency, and you assume skills, and you assume understanding, you assume that you can get to informed consent. I would argue that we can't get to informed consent where we are right now. The other important thing to realize is that, when we start to think about these issues of privacy, many of them are not necessarily about the individual. And most of our more complex issues going forward are going to be about the networked issue of privacy. Now, the way I like to think about network privacy, the most easy legal frame, of course, is joint rights. We post a picture, both of us are in the picture, we have a joint right to the picture, maybe a joint right with the photographer, maybe a joint right that's also with whichever site that the photo was shared with. There's a variety of joint rights. But things get really complicated when people's ideas of being connected are not necessarily even in their model. My favorite of this, and if anybody's working in biology, I think this is one of the most interesting spaces to go down, is to think about how do you understand privacy in bioinformatics, especially in the world of DNA, right? Now, if I decide to share all of my DNA with 23andMe, I haven't just shared my DNA. I have shared the DNA of my brother, of my mother, of my grandparents, of kids that I don't yet have. All of that got shared without necessarily even this idea of joint right, because those kids that I don't yet have aren't even in existence to engage in a joint right, let alone my grandkids. Right? So we need to think about how our privacy is tethered to other people, because so much of this is about that tethering. So when a company decides to algorithmically interpret your material aggregated with all sorts of other people, they own the right to it, but it's also predicated on you. And that complicates, again, all of our basic understandings of privacy. Now this, of course, gets us full circle to the whole challenge of this talk. We think we can understand what's going on. We think that we can achieve a control around this. We think that we can interpret what's going on. But I would argue that it's actually one of the biggest challenges we have going forward. We're getting access to tremendous amounts of data, tremendous amounts of content. We can do really powerful things with what's out there, but we can also make really large mistakes. And since many of you are social scientists in the room, I implore you to think about your skills as a critical scholar, as asking hard questions, and as thinking about the power of interpretation to start engaging on a lot of these issues, particularly in light of big data, but also in light of all of the different battles that are happening around data and information flow going forward. Thank you very much. And I am open to questions. Questions? Yeah. Hey, do we want to mic this, or how does? I'll just repeat it for the camera. Okay.
Well, thank you very much. It was fascinating. I'm a privacy researcher, and I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about the whole idea of commodification or like the privacy as commodity. Making users the choice to buy and sell information, and what do you think about it? And also, as a big data researcher, can you talk a little bit about the ethics of using users' data and informed consent, or the lack of it, and how can we use the data that we so carefully want to help protect?
So the question for you, oh dear camera, was first about commodification and how do we think about the money that is made off of a lot of this data, and the second is the ethics of doing research involving big data, especially in light of all of these questions about privacy. So I'll first talk about the commodification. There is no doubt that this has been an angle that's been going for a long time, and this again predates the internet. Advertising is not a new thing. It's been a way of funding our media for a while. It's been a way of funding a whole variety of different systems. The fact is we've gotten a lot better at it. We've gotten a lot better at identifying people. Historically, of course, we would assume that if you're reading Haaretz, you're interested in these things and we'll give you ads accordingly. We've gotten better over time, whereas you're reading it in Israel, you're going to be different than you're reading it in the US, and you start to do that kind of demographic-based separation. We are increasingly getting to the point where we can do really targeted and detailed advertising. And this is a really complex issue, because on one hand, people want advertising that they feel is relevant to them. They want things that are interesting. And when a good advertisement is there, people don't complain, right? You're searching for, information on how to travel to India. Getting that kind of feedback of places to go in India can actually be quite useful. But what becomes creepy is when it's taken out of context. When all of a sudden that commercial interest starts to leak into your personal life. And this is where we have these challenges where we don't understand a lot of what these spaces are. Is a space like Facebook a place where you're hanging out with your friends? In which case you sort of don't want it to have a commercial sentiment to it. But what does it mean of it being a public space? And of course, it's not necessarily to say that your social lives are not also commoditized, right? You might go to a pub, you've spent money, and you've spent money based on the brand of that pub, that pub. That's the place to go drinking because that's the identity that you have with your friends. You associate it with it, you associate it with the bar, and you buy drinks and you purchase. But the challenge is that's not necessarily the trade-off that you've made in a lot of social media. And I think that this is actually where untangling all of this and seeing where people's boundaries are is not actually easy. There's no right answer. The other issue is that where do we start to pay for things, right? And paying for things is a really complex issue, on a global scale, right? One of my jokes of coming to Israel is that I often come to Israel and I get all of the TV shows that I can't get in the States because I don't own a television. But actually downloading them in the States is so regulated that it's easier to download them here because nobody bothers checking on what you download. And so you have these weird cross-cultural issues of how some of these boundaries flow, right? And I think that we've got a whole variety of those commercialization issues because, frankly, you're never the target population for an American company. Right? The American companies are focused on the places that will make them a lot of money. The result of which is that an Israeli population's needs or interests actually are never recognized by these big global players because it's not necessarily what's in their commercial interests. So I think that we've got this whole set of different tensions that are at play where there's no exact answer, and I think the challenge is figuring out how to navigate this. My best path forward is by having as much of an informed public as possible. And this is actually where I'm a big believer in media literacy and critical media literacy. And again, this is me pleading to those of you who are scholars in the room. People need to understand how these trade-offs work. Right? What have you traded off by going to Facebook? What have you traded off by using services where you're trading data for what is free? Because there is nothing that is free. But the thing is as long as people don't understand this, the social norms can't be a regulatory force. So that's where I believe that there's no clean answer to this. It's a complete ball of mess. But what was really clear is that we need to construct media literacy. Now, the question of ethics of looking at this. You'll notice that I use pictures all over the place. And I use names. The thing that might be, the thing that might not be clear in all of this, these pictures are all stock photos that I've either purchased or Creative Commons down in there. They're not actually the pictures of the teenagers I talked to. Whenever I use content from people's pages, if you've ever seen profiles that I've ever used in talks, they're all photoshopped. I actually never make young people more visible than they were before. It's an ethical decision. It's a belief that I have that I am able to make people more visible, for better or worse, and I have a responsibility to treat that visibility with a level of respect. It's also where I think it's really critical as researchers when we do large-scale analysis. What are the things that are really driving the ways in which we approach this? How do we make certain that as researchers we're really respecting the boundaries of the population? We're treating their data with the respect that is offered to us? It is public. And we've had a long-standing debates in sociology and anthropology about observing things that are public. But at the same time, there are costs to using that public material. And the other thing I think is really critical with it is that whenever we're using that public material, not only do we treat it with respect, but we really try to honor the populations that we're talking about. And I think a lot about different ways in which you can honor populations. Really making certain that their voices are heard when they actually are not empowered enough to speak, making certain that their needs are respected, making certain that there's things given back. And this is where, my anthropological training shows full force. I'm a big believer in always giving back to the communities that I study. And I do it from a variety of different ways. I spend a lot of time volunteering in groups. I spend a lot of time speaking in communities where it's really important to understand what's going on. And I donate in different ways when that's appropriate. But I think that all of us have to have these hardcore ethics issues. And I think that one of the damaging things about the IRB structure is that we've put off the responsibility to somebody else to tell us whether or not something is ethical. And I think that the IRB is really good for putting in harsh restrictions on things that are seriously unethical, but it's really devastating for starting a really important ethical conversation as researchers. And I think that in many ways we need to bring that back into our home communities, and we need to bring that question of ethical research into communities who haven't had that history. And in particular here, I'm thinking about communities like physics, computer science, who are all starting to do big data analysis off of found data, but have no history of debating ethics. So I think that this is where these ethics issues, in many ways, aren't new, but I think we need to find ways to actually have that conversation in a contemporary environment and not just sort of give it as a responsibility to the human subjects boards. Forgive me, I've been dealing with a cough forever. Question? Yeah?
Yeah, just that's about the coding. We noticed in Israel that, you used to have something happen and you have like really sometimes racist comments, yeah? And what happened now in Facebook is when people respond, you have all the Facebook, the name and appear the really racist comment, and then the media often takes it and advertise it. And I was wondering what's the right thing to do there? I mean, there was a famous case of a Palestinian bus where a lot of children died in an accident, and then the media just, somebody put it on just went and collected all this data, then gave it to the media, and it was like British. And all those people were exposed, and now that too.
Right.
I mean, in a way, I kind of I condemn them in a way, because I feel also for them that they didn't think that it will be like this kind of. Is this their responsibility or someone else?
So journalistic values have historically argued that when you put things out, when you make people more visible, you have to do it in a way that it's for the good of the public. And that's a hard decision to make. And it's an even harder decision to make when your news time from the point of hearing a story to putting it out to print is 2 minutes at this point for a lot of people. Right? And I think this becomes a really hard thing to do in real time, is to really think through the consequences of it. Now that said, I do believe that there's an important conversation to be had about ethics within the media. I think that there's a lot of media that have veered off in the wrong direction. This goes back to the commodification issue. The idea of the media having to actually get as many page views as possible for their story, to make their stories as salacious as possible, to get the headline out there so that people will pick it up, I think is actually spiraling a lot of this into really unethical practices. But I would also say that we're in a school of social science and humanities. You guys are training the next generation of journalists. And if you're not having a conversation with them about ethics, who is? So I think that this is actually where that ethics conversation isn't just among us as researchers, but it's really about the public writ large. Because the other challenge with this is that we want to hold journalists responsible in certain ways, and they have certain codes of conduct that are really important. But when all of us are creating media, when people are putting out Twitter messages for our interpretations, and I mean, gosh knows, during this conflict, we are seeing plenty of people putting out wholly inappropriate things on Twitter that gets picked up by the media. So the blurring of who is a journalist and who is just a public person using Twitter is very hard. That's why these ethics issues of making things more visible, who's moving what content, are really important, again, as a societal level conversation. So I'm in favor of thinking about people who have that power to make people more visible, held responsible for the costs and consequences of those decisions. I think that we are actually going to see this in some of the fallout of the BBC on a totally different set of topics. I'm sure you guys have seen some of the cases that are playing out there regarding all of the child pornography issues, about who they chose to shine a spotlight on and who they didn't. Right? So there's all of that accountability to the media, but we need to think about that accountability to us as citizens. Right? And I think this is where all of us, by choosing what we share, we need to think about what we're shining a spotlight on. right? Whether you've got an audience of 10,000 or whether you've got an audience of 100, what you choose to share on Facebook has consequences. It helps set the norms. And one of my projects, I'm looking at fear. And one of the things that's been really frustrating to me is to look at the same tactics that we've seen the media use to fearmonger. We are now seeing public citizens use to fearmonger amongst their cohorts, right? The things that you share on Facebook about like the terribleness of vaccines, or the terribleness of a population that you don't agree with, right? That has consequences. So that's why I think that these ethics issues are really important for us to have as researchers. But you all should please have them with your students because we need them to be a public conversation. Yeah.
I'm working, my name is Zimmerman from the Ministry of Education. I have a comment and a question. The comment is that in Israel we have the same figures that you stated about cyberbullying. The last survey showed that 3 to 7% reporting being bullied, cyberbullied, and 30 to 40 being bullied at school. So we have the same proportion. And I have a question. We issued last year regulations forbidding teachers being friends with students on the social network, only on the school network. Could you please comment about it?
Sure. So the comment was that the data that I talked about is bullying in the US actually holds true for Israel as well. In other words, what the ministers found is that kids are more likely to be bullied at school than they are in cyber. The question was about how the ministry had made a decision to restrict teachers from friending students and asked me to comment on it. So generally, I disagree with it. Here's why. I actually think that we do a disservice to young people by not allowing them to have healthy interaction with adults in their lives. In Israel, you're not in as an extreme position as we are in the US. In the United States, we have massive age segregation. Age segregation means that young people's social interactions are extraordinarily restricted to people of their same age. They pretty much only socialize with people that are their same grade, basically their same year. There's differences in Israel, in part because you are much more likely to grow up with cousins and with extended family that results in having some diversity of age. In the United States, we see that young people are increasingly having no access to non-custodial adults. Now, a non-custodial adult means somebody who, other than a parent or a teacher, or somebody who holds organizational power over a child. Which means that kids not only don't know somebody who's older than them, like a 14-year-old doesn't know an 18-year-old, but they also don't know somebody who's like 30 that might be an advice giver, that is not somebody who holds power over them. This has actually been really devastating for a whole variety of shifts around social norms. Because what happens is that when young people are actually at risk, they have nobody to turn to but their peers or their parents. And when the parent is the problem, i.e. abuse at home, that is really bad. And when we're talking about a variety of situations that peers are not the best advice givers, let's start with sex, that becomes a really devastating situation, right? And so what you really want in a healthy society is that young people have access to people who are just a few years older than them for advice of certain kinds, and that they have access to non-custodial adults that they can turn to actually make sense of the world and to really provide a support structure that is there. Now, the reason why I think it's dangerous to think about it with schools, for young people in the United States, and I can speak to the US, I think things are a little more flexible here, where you're more likely to have aunts and uncles and a variety of older people that are not teachers. But in the United States, what we found is that young people's best ally to get support when they're going through major problems is their teachers that they really love. It doesn't mean all teachers. Inevitably, there's that one teacher that you think is just cool. And that teacher becomes extraordinarily important. My advice in the US has actually been to do a very specific approach to this, which is that teachers should never friend request students. That power dynamic is dangerous. But when a kid friend requests a teacher, that the teacher should actually be open to it, provided that they're comfortable with that dynamic. I really recommend, and it violates every aspect of Facebook's policy, but I think it's actually important, I really recommend that teachers create a separate account. It's an account where they are able to be teacher. And their friends on that teacher account are their other teachers, are there other people in their academic, or in their school or scholarly environment. And that's the account that they open to students, and that they talk about things that are about being a teacher. And what I've advised in general on this is to do the kinds of open door policies that we expect in schools already, which means that on Facebook, give your password to your principal. If you're totally kosher about everything you're doing, your principal can have your password and can check in on any of it for your teacher account of anything that's going on. If there are any issues, they can be addressed. But I think that it becomes long-term devastating if we restrict opportunities for young people to talk to adults that they trust and respect. And to the degree that that is teachers, we need to open the avenues where they're safe and comfortable for them to have that conversation. Now again, things might vary different in Israel because I realize that there's a little bit more of structures to be in place, but I think it's important to create room when that's healthy. The other thing is that usually this conversation ends up happening because teachers are engaged in inappropriate acts. Yeah, teachers are engaged in inappropriate acts and we need to do something about that. But to harm children's ability to access teachers because some teachers are being awful, it doesn't take Facebook for them to be awful. They will be awful in other ways. And unfortunately, when they're awful in other ways, we don't have it as a tracking record. So if they're awful on Facebook, great, we actually have data to actually go after and address that teacher. But we can't assume that all teachers out there are out there to do terrible things to young people. Most people go into this profession, and it's a hard, hard profession. They go into it because they really want to make a difference in kids' lives. And I think it's really important to create as many pathways for them to do that as effectively and efficiently as possible. The other thing I think is to keep in mind is that as we go forward with education, teachers aren't just going to be the person who's lecturing in a school. And all of you in academia are watching that happen really fast. Teachers are going to be the people who mentor you and advise you through pathways and education and learning. And we're seeing that switch happen in certain parts of education already. But I think it's a really big challenge is to actually think about what does education look like when education is about mentoring and support, and how do we start to make that move in that direction? It's not going to happen tomorrow. It might take 20 years, but the thing is we're going there, and I think that when we keep creating these divides, assuming that education will be that game of lecturing that it always has, we will break education. And I mean, in the US, we're seeing it broken on every which dimension. I know that you guys have been seeing some interesting, it still astounds me that your cost of undergraduate education is $3,000 a year, and it's being protested here. I have to say it gives me a heart attack because, in the US, we're at $40,000 to $50,000 a year for tuition. So the radical difference in it, so I suspect we're going to crack around education faster than you are, but I think that there's important recognition that these dynamics are about really supporting intergenerational healthy interactions. Other questions? Silence. Oh, yeah.
At the second part of your lecture, you gave an example of the different perceptions of privacy between parents and their children. You gave the example of the Facebook statuses that the mother posted a comment to her daughter. And I wanted to ask you, what is the future of the privacy perception? Will these youth change their mind, change their perceptions of privacy when they grow up? Are we in a new era of privacy?
I don't think that we're in a new era of privacy. I think that there are aspects of data. We're in a new era of data, but that doesn't mean that the values and goals about privacy are suddenly radically different. The values and goals still stand, but the values and goals are life stage specific. And that's one of the reasons why we will see differences with what young people want right now than when they're in their 20s. That life stage dynamic is that when you are a teenager and you don't have much freedom or flexibility, you don't have a car, you're not allowed to go very far, your friends live too far to walk to their houses, your parents make you be home because they have a curfew, all of this, all you want is any opportunity to socialize, right? And so the goals of sociality drive so much of what people are willing to share and what they're willing to do in order to achieve that as the end goal. Now, we see some interesting shifts at different life stages. One of my favorite of which is what people are willing to share when they're dating. right? You're willing to put up all sorts of profiles in the hope that you might find a partner, right? And that's a moment where what you share shifts because of your goals and your desires. But there are other shifts that happen. One of the things, so I live in New York City, and some of you might have seen that we had a small hurricane, which has been, it's been great to go from hurricane to the Middle East. That's been a nice shift in mindset. But one of the things about living through that hurricane that we saw was that people for whom location privacy really matters, all of that changed during the hurricane. People were willing to share all sorts of things about where they were at for a variety of different reasons. And when this was pointed out to me, I was really embarrassed because, of course, when the building next to me collapsed, the first thing that my partner and I did was, ooh, the building next door collapsed, which, of course, translated to, I live exactly at 8th and 14th, and you can tell that by my willingness to share about this moment. So there's a situation in which our privacy norms change. We saw a lot of that actually happening with regard to Sandy, of people being like, I need help, and this is where I'm at. Now that's actually where persistence becomes difficult, right? Because now that data is there for good, even when people don't want that. The same is true with dating profiles. One of the things that I'm having fun with is watching teenagers find their parents' dating profiles. That never goes over well and is a source of a tremendous amount of teasing. And sort of the only thing close to it is when when kids find out that their parents' friends have embarrassing teenage photos, right? Because those are even more delightful. Right? So you get these weird life stage, and situational privacy issues that really change. Another crowd that I think is interesting in light of all of this is the 65 plus crowd. They are the crowd that we're going to see a massive new onset of things. Because the thing about people who are in their middle ages is that they're often thinking about employment. Once you're 65, bosses don't matter, nothing matters, you're willing to put up amazingly embarrassing things, right? And so, you have that moment where your grandfather suddenly says things and you're like, really? I didn't want to know that. Right? So we're seeing that. And you're starting to see some of that in the US with the 65 plus crowd, who they're coming on board with a totally different set of privacy norms because they've reached a life stage where, who cares? Right? And so I think that we have to deal with these life stage issues and realize that their shifts are going to happen. Now that doesn't mean it's going to be easy to make those shifts. And one of the things that I think that today's teenagers are going to be challenged by is that those shifts are going to be really hard. And those shifts are going to be complicated, but we haven't yet felt them en masse. So for the longest time, my favorite thing that teenagers would do would, of course, they'd delete their original, like take IM. When AOL Instant Messenger and MSN Messenger were really popular pre-Facebook, teenagers would be really proud of deleting their IM account and creating a new one when they went to college because they were more mature. Right? And they suddenly were more cautious about what they were sharing. And likewise, when I graduate from college, I'll share differently. But now when you think about persistence, when you think about the difficulty it is to remove your Facebook account or move on, we start to see these uncomfortable fractures. This is also why, honestly, I think that Facebook actually has some really uncomfortable futures in front of it. Because I see a lot of young people who've been on it for 5-6 years and now aren't thrilled. They're making transitions in their lives, and Facebook is not allowing them to make that transition. And that's going to be an interesting challenge for the company. Already I'm seeing, in the US, Facebook pretty heavily plateaued as an emotional place. So when I think about usage, I don't just think about raw numbers and who actually visits the site, but I think about emotion and passion and dedication to a site. The dedication to Facebook in the US plateaued last year. And it is declining this year. And I think about years in school years, since I spend too much time with teenagers. So it's declining this year. This year it's about Instagram and Twitter in the US. Of course, Instagram is Facebook, but we'll ignore that. But it becomes this interesting challenge about why moving to a different site is a way of attempting to achieve that privacy. But I think that we've got a lot of complications to get there, and I think that's where we'll see those collisions going on. But I also think that's also why we're going to see a lot more encoding. I think the encoding is going to become much more normative. A decade ago, I could read what young people were posting on MySpace. I could make sense of it. I could understand the references that they were using. And today, it's not just because I'm old, but today I see so much more encoding. Pronouns are much more prevalent today than they ever were when I was looking at it a decade ago. A decade ago, I could literally follow the names and make sense of it. Today, it's all pronouns. I can't. Today, it's all references to things that happened on a different site or offline, where I don't have the local knowledge to follow those conceptual links. That is the one thing that I'm seeing young people really do, to achieve this in light of these dynamics. And that's what gives me a clue that this is not a generational issue. Because as long as they're doing that, as long as they're making an effort at it, it's really clear that they still care. And as long as they still care, we aren't seeing a radical shift. One more question? Yes?
Europe now is approaching the right to be forgotten. It's made a legal issue in Europe. Do you see this experience also in the US, or there's something different going around them?
So the US and Europe have very different approaches to how they think about privacy and who they're afraid of. In the US, nobody really cares about companies. They absolutely are panicked about the government being able to get access to their information. In Europe, we see a very opposite approach to thinking about data. The Europeans, by and large, believe that their governments are good actors and believe that companies are absolutely evil. So most of the right to be forgotten is so heavily framed around corporations that it doesn't actually resonate or make sense in an American context. Most Americans aren't particularly panicked about companies and advertisers getting access to their data. Yes, there's the Target example, which is sparking some conversation, but mostly that's not where the point of panic is about. The point of panic is about certain things like, who gets to look at your employment, your information for employment. So like there's a really nasty battle happening in New Jersey in the US over an employment privacy issue. The basic case is that in many jobs in the US now, when you go and apply for a job, the potential employer makes you log into your Facebook and show them all of your content on Facebook. This is being challenged because it's seen in very much that governance structure, and that makes sense. But the right to be forgotten doesn't quite make sense in the US, and I think that's where we got some complications. That said, it's really important to realize that privacy laws are no longer about jurisdictional specificity, and this is, I think, what's going to complicate things. If Europe decides to regulate over the right to be forgotten and goes forward with all of the plans, it will affect American companies who are operating in Europe, which means there will be some abiding by it. The same is true vice versa. You guys are stuck dealing with really dumb American laws on a regular basis because it's easier for companies to deal with things globally. My favorite, and the one that I deal with on a regular basis, is the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, COPPA. COPPA is so well intended. The goal is to empower parents to make certain that kids' data is not used or manipulated against them. The result of which is that it just makes that every major site restricts access to anybody 13 years or younger, under 13, not being allowed to use the site. That means that when you're using Facebook in Israel, you can't have those kids using it either. So you get these sort of international dynamics,
They just lie about their age.
So not only do kids lie about their age, but parents actually help them. Parents actually help create most of the accounts, and the European data is even more strong on this than the American data. So we've got these jurisdictional issues. So in many ways, the Brussels debates that are happening, it doesn't matter whether or not the US agrees with them or not. It will affect it. It's also why the global conversations around privacy are so important right now. On that note, thank you all for your attention and participation.
Thank you, Danah.